You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello, and welcome to Campus Talks, the fortnightly podcast from Times Higher Education that asks academics from around the world for their advice and insight on all aspects of the global university sector. I'm Eliza Compton, Deputy Editor of Campus. For this episode, we're talking about course design, which seems appropriate as universities from across the Northern Hemisphere get ready to welcome students back into the classroom. Course design, as educators and instructional designers will well know, is the planning of a class to ensure that students meet their learning goals and outcomes. It considers not just classroom activities, but also what forms assessment will take and ways to create a learning environment where students feel motivated and engaged to learn. My guest today is Daniel Guberman. Daniel is a Senior Instructional Developer and Assistant Director of Student-Centred Pedagogy in the Centre for Instructional Excellence at Purdue University. He is co-author with Purdue colleagues Emily M. Bonem and Chantal Levesque-Bristol of Designing Impactful College Courses, Applying Self-Determination Theory to Unleash the Potential of Autonomy-Supported Learning Environments, which was published by Routledge in May. He has a PhD in music from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His work includes coordinating the Student Pedagogy Advocates program at Purdue, supporting alternative grading practices, and helping instructors create student-centred learning environments through the university's long-running Impact Instructor Development program. And for us, he has lots of practical advice and insight into course design that will make each learning unit or module meaningful for both teachers and students. But before we hear from Daniel, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about a forthcoming event. The Innovation and Impact Summit 2026, hosted by Times Higher Education in partnership with Korea University, will be held in Seoul from the 17th to the 19th of November. The event will bring together university leaders, researchers, entrepreneurs and investors to explore how universities can scale innovation, commercialise research and build partnerships that drive real change. To secure your ticket, visit timeshighereducation.com/events/upcoming, or you can find a link in the show notes to book your ticket and use the promo code CAMPUS20 for an exclusive 20% discount. But now on to today's interview with Daniel Guberman. Hi Daniel, and welcome to Campus Talks.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with an overall question. What is course design?
So we are really looking mostly at this small unit of what one instructor or sometimes multiple instructors are doing together to teach, a confined thing to classes. What we're trying to do in this book and our other work is to really help faculty and instructors think strategically and meaningfully and intentionally about what they're doing in their classes. So that means what students are going to learn, how they'll know that students have learned the things they want them to learn, what they'll do to get students to progress from where they enter that class to the end of the class, right? And to do it in a way that, we center around motivation. So do it in a way that really helps drive internal motivation for students to not only learn it for a test, but to learn it for, a longer life endeavors, whatever those are, whether it's the career they're going into, or just because it's something that will be meaningful to them and enrich their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So aiming for learning that sticks. Now, you mentioned your book, which is the book that's come out in May, which is Designing Impactful College Courses, Applying Self-Determination Theory to Unleash the Potential of Autonomy-Supported Learning Environments, which was co-written with your colleagues at Purdue, Emily M. Bonem and Chantal Levesque-Bristol. We will get into self-determination theory a little bit later. But to get more into the nitty-gritty of course design, who needs to know about it? Is it just educators, or are there other people in the university who would benefit from these skills?
Well, I think everyone would benefit from really understanding what it means to design a course intentionally and meaningfully. Obviously, the primary audience for our book and the people we work mostly with, so at Purdue, we're in our teaching center. So we work with instructors on designing their courses. Primarily, we also work with administrators and others too. But we're really thinking first about, the people who are teaching these courses because they tend to have, and this varies, but they tend to have a lot of autonomy in what they can do. Sometimes they don't perceive that autonomy. Sometimes they feel like administrators are telling them what they can do, but there is a lot of freedom in how they can approach teaching things that they're teaching. Now, beyond them, though, we think it's really important both for administrators to understand what it means to, give individual instructors the power to meaningfully make decisions about what they're teaching. So, as you said, we'll get into self-determination theory more, but, if the goal is autonomy for our students, it's the same things are true about autonomy for our instructors, our lecturers, our faculty, that if they feel empowered, then they're going to have a more meaningful experience, and that will translate to students having a more meaningful experience. But this also comes in broader things. So when we're thinking about how do we assess, a big question now is how do we know that students are learning the things we want them to learn? Right? And especially in an age of AI being everywhere, this is an increasingly complicated question. And this is where really understanding what it means to design a meaningful course and to build meaningful assessments and activities into that course becomes really important because otherwise, if we go to some of these traditional approaches where we just let students off and then they take a test at the end and we say, okay, they scored this on a test, it's really hard to know what that actually means for what students have learned. So we think it will really benefit everyone at all levels to understand what it means to design a course. And even students, to the degree that they can come into a course thinking about what does it mean when an instructor says, oh, here are the learning objectives or learning outcomes for a class, right? Or when they say, here's the way you're going to be assessed, students don't necessarily know what that means. And the students who do, tend to be better at navigating our systems and tend to get more out of them. And the students who struggle to even understand like these broad concepts, which is not their own fault, it's because no one's told them. And this is foreign language essentially to them when they walk onto a university campus. They can often struggle to make sense of where they should spend their time and what they should be doing and focusing on and how they can navigate the system to succeed both academically and professionally and personally. So, we think everyone benefits from learning about course design, but obviously bias there.
Well, I think justified. So course design is really the engine that kind of sits behind what's going on in the classroom. The thing about your book is that it's really a how-to book of course design, which obviously has a broad audience, principally educators, but also many other people, as you've just explained. It uses a backwards design approach to course design, so focusing on learning outcomes, assessment, and activities. Can you tell us where you begin the process?
Yeah, and this is why we call it backwards because, we think of the outcomes as the thing that happens at the end. So we start with that end in mind, right? So when we start, we try to think, well, what is it I want students to leave this class being able to do? What should they know? What values should they have? It's a wide range of things can come out of a course, but what do I want them to be able to do or know? Right. And then when we work from there, it becomes much easier to start saying, well, how will I know if they could do this thing? Right. And then what can I do with them to help them to get to the point where I can know they can do this thing? Right. And this is very different than, a lot of traditional courses. And we see this all the time still are here's all the content and we need to fit all this content and these fields continue to grow. So, what was content 20 years ago, now has hundreds of more pages of the textbook, but our class time is the same, right? So I think the traditional approach has just been we pack more and more stuff and just hope students get more and more out of the experience where when we work with instructors, we don't require that they cut down the content, but we find that a lot of them, and starting with what is it I really want students to be able to do or know, then they're able to streamline that content and think, okay, in this wide world of, infinite content, what are the things that are really important for them in whatever progression they're working on? And that's where also thinking about sort of the whole program level is good too, because we don't design a course in a vacuum. In many cases, it leads into other courses, right? So how can we make sure they're ready for what comes next? How can we identify the things where like this might be the only place they're going to experience that? And what does that mean for us? For something where we're going to introduce students to this here, and then they're going to experience more of it later in another course, right? So I think this is where we really try to start with what is the goal that we have for students, and then we work up from there to ensure we can get students to that goal.
Do you break it down day by day, so to session by session, or do you chunk it more broadly than that, say semester by semester? How does that process happen?
Yeah, so we've been doing this for 15 years with hundreds of faculty, and we find it varies a lot by the instructor's like personality and how they think about and conceptualize the course. So some like really do think day by day. And so my background is in music history. When I taught music history, I would really think like, okay, this is the thing for this day. And like, here's the pieces of music I want them to know. We're talking about opera in like the early 19th century. So here's what they need to know about opera. And we've got, a week to do that, right? Where for others, it's more holistic. So when I taught music theory, on the other hand, it was more, I want them to grow to this endpoint and it all builds on each other. So, then it's more, okay, by, 5 weeks in, I really want them to be here. But if they're not here, it doesn't help me to just keep going. Then I need to slow down a little and adjust the plan. So I think it depends partly on the discipline, partly on the nature of the course, and partly on who's teaching it. That some people really like to have that like day by day, I've got 3 small outcomes for each day, and others like thinking more holistically. And then there are others like me who sort of adapt to the moment, I guess.
I can see that. So there's many different ways that educators can come at this. I mean, one of the great things I think about the book is that one, it's geared to all disciplines, but also it's got case studies all the way through, doesn't it? So there's one where the instructor is talking about teaching ethics, and across the course, across the department, there seems to be general agreement that ethics is a good thing to teach. But when the students were asked, they didn't understand that they were being taught ethics very much at all. So is it then necessary when you're designing the course to connect constantly back to those learning outcomes and perhaps also connect forward to how you're going to then assess them?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great example of a case where everyone sort of assumed someone else was teaching this, right? Because ethics are important in lots of disciplines, but a lot of people think like, oh, like the content is important for me, so someone else will teach them ethics, or they'll just like apply ethics magically because it will like come to them. And this was an instructor who really felt like I am going to take responsibility for this. So she built that into the outcomes of the course. And when we talk about outcomes, so we try to differentiate it because terminology gets used in all sorts of different ways. So we try to use the word outcomes to refer to 3 to 5 big goals for the whole semester, so for the whole unit. Whereas we'll talk about objectives being, you might have 3 objectives in an individual day, session, hour, right? So then when she has those big outcomes, it's like, okay, now I need to make an outcome about ethics. And then ideally, and this is the thing that when you design in this way, we encourage everyone to do, is to refer back to them. Because I think too often students will see the syllabus and it will have outcomes on it, but then the instructor never talks about those outcomes again. And like students don't read the syllabus every day, even if we might want them to. So, it's then incumbent upon us to refer back and to make those connections, because also the thing as experts we're good at is making connections. So we might, talk about a case study and we see how ethics is really central to every decision they're making. But for students, they're looking at this case study and they're looking at like the finance and the legal elements, and they're not thinking this is an ethical decision, even though on some level they are. So we need to point out to them that like, hey, when you made that decision, let's think about the ethical elements of that decision and what that means, and let's tie it to these broader, what we're talking about in the whole course. So I think it makes us really be cognizant of how the course progresses and the connections between different elements of the course too.
So I started out by saying that course design is an invisible machine that runs
Yeah.
underneath. But in fact, what you're saying is that in order for course design to be effective, it actually needs to be more explicit and for those outcomes to be transparent. And for you, when you're designing a course, to then build in ways to make those important points, those 3 to 5
Yeah.
learning objectives clear, learning outcomes, sorry.
Yeah.
Clear.
Yeah, exactly that. Like we really encourage instructors, and obviously there are different ways to do this, but the more transparent you can be about what you want your students to learn, the more likely they are to learn it. And also the more likely are they to maintain it and to bring it with them, right? We don't think it's really ever valuable to be secretive about what we want students to learn. Generally speaking, we should tell them what we want them to do, and we should give them the tools to do it, and then we should, assess them appropriately. So I think sometimes people view higher education as like, and students take this view that like it's an attempt to trick them, that like they go into a test and it's like this question is designed to trick them. And like we don't think that's generally a valuable way to design a test, because then you don't know, did they just like misread the question because I put too much stuff in there to confuse someone, right? Or did they actually not understand the process, right? And that's a big difference in what it means to get a question wrong, right? Now, doesn't mean we can't have complicated, complex questions, but students should know that that's part of what our goal for their learning is to navigate these complicated situations and to pull out the important information. Right. And I think that's a really important thing to explain to students when we do that, as opposed to, making it surprising on the test, which, we see and hear from students all the time that they'll leave a test and they'll be like, I didn't know any of this was going to be on the test, which, I'm sure in many cases the instructor would disagree, but that's a sign of miscommunication, right? Rather than like an intentional teaching decision, we think.
I think that is a general perception, is that tests are kind of a test, a puzzle to be solved, rather than an opportunity to showcase learning and to affirm to the instructor, in fact, that they've been successful. When you're working with other educators within Purdue, looking at things like learning outcomes assessment and activities, what is your sense when you're doing this of which is the most difficult aspect of course design, the one that perhaps educators struggle with to make decisions about or maybe to get right?
Yeah. So, and I'll say my bias here is that I'm also part of an alternative grading community. So I think a lot about grading structures. So from that perspective, but I think most of my colleagues who aren't deeply invested in grading structures would agree with me that I think assessment is probably the most challenging one, because it's the one that I think has most traditionally been done sort of poorly or haphazardly. It's also the one that instructors just aren't excited about. No one's excited to make a test, right? And, we might be excited to like assign a paper, but then when we need to read 100 papers in a week to give marks to them, like then we get really burnt out really fast, right? So I think the assessment part is one that can become really demoralizing for instructors. So then I think it means that and it's also really stressful for students. So I think there's a lot of angst around it from all different sides. So to me, that's the most challenging part to do in a meaningful way, because it takes time. And I think it doesn't feel like time that's devoted to learning for a lot of instructors, right? We're excited when we see students learning. So when we're doing activities or assignments or having discussions, and even like giving a lecture and seeing students' faces respond to us, we can be really excited by that. But then when we have the test, it feels very impersonal. So I think we tend to give it the least amount of time, right? People will design their tests, 3 days before it's given, right? And then I think it doesn't do as good a job of measuring. And measuring is the key element to know if students have learned. In the US, the main thing they leave with is a grade, right? When they go and apply for a job or apply for graduate school, what they see is a single grade that boils down all this stuff, and it mostly comes from these assessments. So to me, that's the most challenging part and it's also the part with the most opportunity because I think we can do assessments, and there's a lot of examples of doing assessments in really interesting and creative ways and giving students multiple opportunities and different avenues to express what they've learned, right? But it requires a mindset shift from that I'm trying to create rigor by making things hard or difficult to navigate to I really want to give my students an opportunity to show me what they've achieved and what they've learned. And I think when we shift our mindset to that desire of I want my students to demonstrate this, then I think that's a really great opportunity to think critically about what it means to assess their learning in interesting ways.
So really thinking when you're designing the course, coming back to those learning outcomes, what do we
Yeah.
want the students to have achieved by the time they've finished, and how do we design assessment that allows us to see that and allows them
Yeah.
to demonstrate the breadth of their learning.
Yeah.
So you mentioned AI. I just want to pop a question in here about
Yeah.
it because it feels like AI has done a lot to disrupt traditional approaches to assessment. Are you seeing other sorts of ideas come through that are now coming through into course design as a result of that?
Oh yeah, all the time and I think what happened was during the pandemic, we got more flexible. We started to think, oh, we can let students do some of these assignments at home, and that can lead to more rich discussions in class and really more effective learning. But now anything that we're giving students the opportunity to do at home, we need to start thinking well, was this the student or was it AI? And that means people are bringing a lot more assessment back into the classroom, which I think actually has a lot of promise. I don't think that's bad, right? But I think we then need to be strategic in how we do it. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to be like, oh, well, the quiz I used to have you do at home before class, I'm just going to do that for 10 minutes now, right? We can really think, what does it look like? What does it mean for me to spend 20 minutes of my hour-long class time devoted to assessment practice, and how can I make that meaningful and impactful and then use the information that's because really students are sharing information about what they know, and then how can I use that information meaningfully to help further their learning wherever they are. So that's where I really like systems that give students multiple opportunities to demonstrate that they've achieved something. And then if they haven't achieved it yet, instead of saying oh, you failed or, whatever grade, it's okay, you don't get this part yet. And here's what you should practice. And the next time, you try again. And I think that's where AI can be really valuable for students when students are in different places of achievement. For the students who are starting to fall behind, often a lot of these systems can give them meaningful study and practice if they know what to ask, right? If they're giving guidance on where they seem to be confused or where they're stuck. Often these systems, because they can be personalized and can provide infinite feedback, can help guide them to an approach that will work for them or to an understanding that will work for them that we would only be able to do if we're able to have an individual discussion with them, which, obviously I love when students come to my office hours and we can have that individual discussion. A lot of classes at a place like Purdue, we have 40,000 plus students. We don't have the time, unfortunately, for that. And a lot of students are just scared to go and ask instructor individually. So if they're going to turn to AI, how do we help them use it in a way that will further their education so that then they can come in class and in another opportunity demonstrate that they've achieved, whatever the goals are. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it really requires that we rethink, what we're doing in class and what students are doing at home and what we sort of trust them to do on their own. But I think empowering them is really valuable in this moment.
Mm. A lot of course design is about creating an environment where students are best able to learn. So I want to talk a little bit about the in-class experience. I think this is maybe the right way to frame it. So part of the subtitle of your book is self-determination
Mhm.
theory, which gets into motivation. As you say, students come to
Yeah.
university because they want the qualification at the end. And we often think about motivation as being to do with reward and punishment often. So I think self-determination takes a slightly different approach than this.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a bit about how that feeds into course design?
Yeah, so traditionally we talk about motivation as either like it's intrinsic, it's inside, or it's extrinsic, and extrinsic being rewards and punishments. And generally when we talk about, taking a course, we think it's extrinsic. So then we think like, okay, I'll give them points if they come to class, or I'll give them points if they turn it in on time, or they'll lose points if they don't do this, right? And what self-determination theory says is no, even in extrinsic motivation, there's different categories and different levels that it can be internalized. So rewards and punishments would fall into external regulation, which is the most external form of extrinsic motivation. And what they say is like, yes, this will get people to do things, but it won't get them to care about them. And it won't get those things to have meaning to them. And what we really want is students to care about the learning that they're doing and to find meaning in it. And if we rely on external motivators, then students will, even if they enter our class finding meaning, the external motivators can actually like override that meaning and it can become, no, I'm just doing this for a point, not because like, I feel like internally inspired to, be an engineer. But then what they say is there's other types of extrinsic motivation that feel more internalized. And the two big categories are identification and integration. So identification is when we can understand how what we're being asked to do, so the problem we're being asked to solve, the stuff we're being asked to memorize, align with our personal goals and values, right? So, I often talk about medical students, right? Because it's sort of the typical one, they're asked to memorize a lot of stuff. To get into the good medical schools, I need perfect grades, so I need to do well on the tests. They sort of memorize all this stuff and then they forget it because the class is now over and they've passed the test, right? But they're often doing it because they care. They want to help people, right? So if they're learning these things and they can see why, learning human anatomy will help them in the process, not just of sort of achieving the checks to become a doctor and, get a paycheck or something, but to actually be effective and to help someone, who dealt with the same thing that their grandparents or parents dealt with or their sibling dealt with, then they're more likely to internalize and value what they're learning. So identification is that like knowledge of I can see that. And then integration is a step further. And this is like the feeling of like, this is who I am. So with engineering students, which Purdue has a very large engineering program, there's a lot of like, we want students to feel like they are engineers from when they start this program. And this is what integration is all about. It's like, am I identifying as an engineer? And what an engineer does is like makes these types of ethical and decisions rooted in math as well as all the decisions about society and societal structures and what they want society to look like in the future. So the more we can help students see that, right, and we do that through meeting basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, then the more they're likely they are to internalize motivation for their learning is sort of the fundamental premise.
This seems difficult to do from the outside. So, does this
Yeah.
involve designing broadly to present opportunities for students to make these connections, maybe in terms of autonomy, designing in things like choice and competency, given levels of engagement where you can feel yourself progressing? Or is this about having a bit of flexibility in your design so that you can adapt as you get to know your students?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it depends partly on the class. And one of the things we talk about with instructors is all of these, so autonomy, competence, and relatedness, they're basic needs that are felt individually. But for autonomy, which is often the most complicated one when we think about designing a class, and that's ultimately what you're asking about, right, is this flexibility, is that that need can also be met through a meaningful explanation, right? So if we're teaching, anatomy and physiology, which at least in the US is a very well-known class for just being lots of memorization for medical professionals because there's a lot to know about the body, right? So if you explain to students why that memorization is important, because ultimately, if you don't remember all these things, when you start trying to put them together and make meaningful decisions with a patient, you're really not going to have much to go on, right? You need to understand all these different parts of the body and how they interconnect and interrelate. But that means you need to memorize a lot of stuff before you can get to the making the meaningful decisions, right? So you need that foundational knowledge. So if you explain that, that can satisfy that need and sort of help students understand why there's not as much flexibility. In other classes, so I'm fortunate that I've been teaching in our honors college where I teach small classes that are the ones I designed. So I've been teaching a class on grading in higher education, right? So that one a lot more flexible. So I can go in and say, okay, here's our general outline, but I also want space for the things that you're interested in. So, and you might have things you're interested in right now at the beginning and you can share that, but also we're going to check in 5 weeks because then you'll have a better sense of what we're actually talking about. You'll have done some reading and you might say, yeah, I really want to go down this path. And then we can talk about, is this a path we go down as a whole class? Is this a path that like informs your individual project? How do we make that meaningful to you? So I think there's different ways to do it, and it depends on the type of class. And that to me is one of the fun things that we get to work with hundreds of instructors in all these different situations and having all these different, administrative pressures on them of what needs to be in their class or not, and helping them navigate how they can best support students based on the situation that they're in.
Thank you so much for that explanation. So just as a final question then, Daniel, one of the parts of the title of the book, again, is impactful course design.
Yeah.
And so how do you know when you've put your course together and you've taught it that it has been impactful?
Yeah. And I'll say that part of the title is actually a play because the program that we have at Purdue, we call Impact. So it's built on this program. And we've been measuring this for 15 plus years. And what we measure is not grades because ultimately some instructors go through this process and grades go up. Some, like they go through this process and grades stay the same, but it's because they're measuring different things in different ways. So what we actually measure is we measure students' perceptions of the learning environment. So we measure their motivation and we measure their sense that their basic needs are being met. And what we see consistently is that when instructors go through this process of intentionally designing their courses, their students report that they're more internally motivated and they feel like their needs are being met. And then there's thousands of other studies that have shown, and we've also have some smaller studies that have shown this, that once we do that, then they retain more for future classes, right? So we have all these long-term benefits from that. So, we actually look at the impact through the lens of self-determination theory and looking at student motivation and their perceptions of the learning environment. And then we can extrapolate lots of different things based on, tons of research that both we have contributed to and hundreds, not thousands of others have done over the past 40 years of self-determination theory work. And we think that's a much better approach than just grades because, grades and marks have all these other factors. I mean, I'm sure any listener is familiar with all the discussions in the United States about grade inflation. I'm sure this happens elsewhere. So, we've had an administration for most of this that was very concerned about grade inflation, really did not want that to be at Purdue. So if we went and said, hey, look, grades are up at all these classes, that actually would have harmed us with our administration. So instead what we're able to say is look at the impact it's having on students' learning experiences. And those learning experiences then lead to greater retention, and greater downstream impacts for them that, are what we really want them to get out of their educational journey.
I mean, certainly one of the words that's come out of all the AI discussions is the need for metacognition. So the
Yep.
need to be able to learn, which I think is part at least of what you're talking about here.
Yeah, definitely. And we actually started a spin-off program that we call Impact Critical Thinking, where we're working with whole program, so multiple instructors in the same program, to think about how they can develop critical thinking skills across students' progression, because that's not something that happens in one single course. But traditionally instructors haven't talked to each other about it, right? So we're trying to help that, and then we're hopefully going to be able to measure this. Obviously, it takes, well, we're trying to, we work with instructors, then they implement it the next year, then it takes 4 years for the students to go through the process. So it'll be a long journey of measurement, but we're pretty confident from what we've seen from the instructors and what we've heard from initial implementations that what we'll see is students really developing these thinking and metacognitive skills as they progress through the programs that participate in this.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I have learned a lot about course design.
Thank you so much for having me.
Daniel's explanation shows how meaningful, intentional, effective course design can result in meaningful, effective learning that meets students' need for autonomy, competency, and relatedness. It seems clear that being transparent and explicit about learning outcomes is a key motivating factor that helps students to persist and to succeed. Learning and assessment, after all, are not a trick, and students need to know what educators are aiming to teach them and why this knowledge matters to them and their future lives and careers. I like that he sees both assessment and AI as opportunities, the former to allow students to showcase their learning, and the latter to personalise and fine-tune feedback or revision. So that's it for this episode of Campus Talks. I'd like to thank my guest, Daniel Guberman from Purdue University, for sharing his expertise. For more advice on course design and how it is adapting to a new era of higher education, you can find articles from experts from around the world in our latest Campus Spotlight. Go to timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, a colleague, or your family member even. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.